morning, and welcome to Connections Radio Show, where we talk about ideas that matter. I'm glad you've made the connection and are with us today. I'm Lori Fitz, your host, and I have Rick Bernardo, who co-hosts with me, and the goal of our show is to explore a wide range of topics that challenge us to see ourselves, our community, and the world around us, that get us thinking, remembering, sharing, imagining, and doing this with really interesting guests that help us make new connections. So last week, Rick, by the way, welcome, Rick.
That's me. Hi, I'm Rick.
Rick brought really interesting people together to talk about from being to doing to get the results we want. And it was part of a two-part series, so this is our second part. And last week it was really interesting. We had a variety of voices that talked about angles to approach getting unstuck when we want to do something, or sometimes when we're doing too much and we're not remembering who we are because we're just in this doing place. And we've been exploring how doing and being interrelate.
Yeah.
And sometimes the voices in our head that get us either shaming that we're doing too much or we're not doing enough.
Yeah. What voices? That's the voice that just asked that question in my head to myself. Yeah.
And big picture, how we want to make a difference, and a difference for ourselves, difference for others. And I'm delighted that Diana Christine Teodorescu is joining us again. She helped wrap up our show last week, and she's kicking off this show this week. And one of the things that I'm really interested in that Diana's background brings to us is a whole looking at intergenerational, historic, cultural, race-based trauma. She's got amazing degrees in all kinds. She's got a doctorate in leadership. She's got a master's certificate in marriage and family therapy, and these all have intersections. So welcome, Diana, to help us continue our conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Good to be with you both.
So when we're looking at getting unstuck, sometimes what you were sharing with us last week is kind of can get comfortable with being uncomfortable, and you can do that in a playful way, but it's intentional. You saw yourself as a pebble that kind of gets people bugged enough to start wanting to do something different. But you make the first steps and you go, oh, aha, that's why it hurts, and I get that. But then there's the next steps after that we may not know how to really look at. You know, we're part of something perhaps that it's hard to name.
Yeah, and I think as you say that, Lori, it's like for me, there's a layeredness that comes up, and that's a part of who I am, right? The part of me that sees systems and sees the interconnectedness and the intertwining of different seemingly disparate parts of ourselves or dynamics within the sociocultural milieu. And I sometimes think of it as spokes on a wheel, and yet all of those, or parts of a tapestry, right? All these threads connect together to make this beautiful and not necessarily always easy or pain-free experience, but they create something. And sometimes, so the therapist part of me, 20 plus years ago, Rick, dating myself now, when I first started noticing as I was coming alongside of people and their stories that what was presenting itself, the trauma that was showing up, wasn't only in the child or adolescent that was present. It was present in the caregivers. It was present for generations back, so that intergenerational component. What was lurking kind of in the shadows for me at the time were the other parts of cultural and historical, and I say those as if they're separate things, but there is a lot of overlap. And when I went to do that doctoral degree you talked about, I had a professor. Well, first of all, let me say I thought I was going to not work with trauma anymore. And the universe
I'm done with trauma now.
I'm done with trauma now. Yeah,
Okay, I got it all figured out.
Myself.
Trauma's behind
I got it
me.
all figured out. Trauma, not going to do trauma.
Yeah.
And then the universe said, sure you aren't. And I had a wonderful professor, Dr. Yvette Pye, who showed us the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre.
Oh, my gosh.
Documentary.
Yeah.
it truly flipped my world upside down. Now, I'm not proud of saying that. The thoughts of shame, the feelings of shame and guilt, and the thoughts of how could I not have known, right, were very present as I navigated that, and what that meant to see that, and how could I be the age that I was during my doctoral program and not know that this and so much more, right, has existed within. I'll start with America, right? America has a historical, cultural context, but it goes elsewhere. And then the thought that really I struggled with and do continue to struggle with and be with that creates that discomfort is how do we treat one another differently simply on the basis of the color of our skin, pigmentization, which none of us has any control over.
Right.
Right?
Well, it's in our brain. I mean, that's part of that unconscious bias or implicit bias that we feel safe with. It's a tribal. If there's a difference, then it creates that us and them. And the first thought, I totally get that it's a brain thing, but it's the second thought that we have control over if we take a pause and can own.
I hope this connects, but in the teaching of ethics, it's just so important for me to distinguish between anybody being to blame for something and taking responsibility, which is just, I always say, think of that as not even blame, because we conflate the words a lot of time. Responsibility is able to have a response. So we could be a cause in the matter. We can, that age-old saying, we can be part of the solution and not part of the problem.
I like to switch the I and the A and created a response ability.
Exactly.
That we're able to respond and with empathy.
Yeah, and here's the beauty and the pain in that, right? Is how do we become, right? How do we start acknowledging and become aware of what we might otherwise be oblivious to, right? And for some of us, just swimming in the water, because of that pigmentization, we don't have to struggle as much with. We don't have to be as much with. So how do we start letting ourselves, right, be aware and acknowledge
and uncomfortable
and be with,
because people don't want to be uncomfortable. I think that's why it's like you're blaming me. That happened a long time ago, and it wasn't my fault. Well, we're still in the water here, so we need to be dealing with. There's some icky stuff in the water we're going to have to be dealing with that we're swimming in.
I tell you, any chance I get, I just. It's not a confession in the sense of that I did something wrong, but I own up to the fact that when I go for a job interview, I'm seen as the normal thing. When I go to a store, I don't even worry about somebody following me around in case I'm going to steal something.
Well,
there's so many examples.
I've worked with people that actually changed their name on their resume from Jose to Joe. When they were Jose, they didn't get any callback. Same resume. When they were Joe, dozens of callbacks. Now that's a heartbreak. That's just wrong. But it's part of what people feel more comfortable with, and very often our brain wants to feel comfortable and be with people that are like us because then it's easier. But it's not always better.
And there's so many groups that where I mean, as a white male, I'm sort of the privileged, not intentionally.
But it's hard in all of this when you're feeling this kind of pain. I think there is a natural reaction, and I think white people go to this very easily. Let's just do something. Let's just keep ourselves busy so we don't have to be thinking about it. But the way that you described it just now, I got this vision of like this DNA helix. There's like a DNA of trauma that you can start tracing back. And it can be very healing to look, and we can almost genetically look at where did the trauma start and how do we go back to repair that. And it doesn't mean we fix it, but there's a sense of healing and repairing that I think is important.
Yeah. And I do want to make some of those, so some of the work that I've embarked in the last year is being with Resna Menakem and Carlin Quinn and through the Education for Racial Equity and doing foundations of somatic abolitionism and reparative communal consultation spaces. And in that work, we also do triad work and being together and starting to be with, again, not only from an intellectual space, but really from an embodied space, right? As we're with these things that are discomforting, as we're with these experiences, whether they're in the sociocultural milieu or within ourselves that arise, right? That guilt, that shame, that, I want to distance from that. Mm-hmm. And then being with that somatically and noticing, what am I feeling? What are the sensations, right? Because again, it's so easy for so many of us, or it's easier to disconnect and be in our headspace.
And then when we disconnect, we want to fill it with something, so we might just put that to-do list so that we feel like, well, look what we accomplished and look what we got done.
Yes. And thank you, Lori, for saying that, because there was something that from last week that I was reminded of when you said that interior work that we do, that being within our bodies and doing that communally, right? Because being with it by myself is only one part of it. Mm-hmm. Like really being with you and Rick and doing this together creates that communal, that relational place where we can be with that together and say, oh, this is what I'm feeling or noticing. What are you like? Right. What are you picking up? And, oh, this was really uncomfortable when Diana said this, and I didn't really like it, and how do we keep going to that and in being curious, right? The being curious and having that heart and compassion toward it, mm-hmm. And being with the anger.
Right.
Because the anger and the rage will be there too. So it's all of it, right? All of it together.
Diana, we got to go on this segment, but I want to let you know that we're going to have you come back and we're going to do an even deeper dive in looking at the work that you're doing, because I think it's the next step of making changes so that we can be who we want to be and how we can be together.
I would be honored, Lori and Rick. Thank you.
We look forward to it. And thanks so Welcome back to Connections Radio Show, where we talk about ideas that matter. I'm Lori Fitz, and my co-host is Rick Bernardo. And Rick, this has been a real wonderful journey that you've put together for us. Our first show of the January and 2023 season we looked at gentle intentions. This last week, we were looking at how to differentiate between being and doing, and there's how they work together.
Different approaches to addressing that.
Yeah.
A lot of wise voices that we literally had on.
And we had Diana last week and this week, and that's Diana Christine Teodorescu.
Indeed.
And you had a nice reaction, after that segment as we were talking in the commercial break.
A lot of what everybody, including Diana, was talking about is the inner environment and the outer environment in which we're working. And they're all very aware and versed in that. And I was remembering I used to use this in my ethics courses all the time, a statement by Arthur Miller, who wrote Death of a Salesman, The Crucible. He was also married to
Marilyn Monroe.
Marilyn Monroe. Yeah. So he's wise, maybe. But the quote is the fish is in the water and the water is in the fish, and he would mention that because he realized in his writing, he had no idea how to create a real person on the stage unless he was aware of what was going on inside them, but also what's going on socially in that group, in all the layers. Yeah. The water is in the fish, and the fish is in the water, and vice versa. It's just like, whoa. And we're like that.
Yeah. And Diana did a beautiful job really looking at generational and challenges and trauma and looking back, and I'm thrilled, and I'm looking forward to having her join us for another show.
Yeah,
but
so
could
great.
you
she's got an email address.
The email.
Yeah, just so people know how to reach her. It's DCT. That stands for Diana Christine Teodorescu, but DCT, and then it's the rest of Teodorescu's EODORESCU. DCT Rescue at SomnioQuam. That's Somnio SOMNIO, and Quam, QUAM. There's no L in there. There's no qualms about being in touch with Diana.
There we
All right?
go.
.org. All right.
All right. Well, we now have the privilege of bringing back another guest from last week. Susan Hart Gaines was sharing with us last week about working with high achievers and physicians and the challenges they face. Susan, thank you for joining us again.
Yay.
Thank you for having me.
One of the things that struck me from last week, and if you didn't listen last week, you can go to am950radio.com and you can listen to last week on our podcast. But one of the things that struck me is you did such a beautiful job of sharing when people are under high pressure jobs, whether it's a physician or you're a high achiever in another, how very often they give to everyone else but themselves.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a chronic issue in our society today. We're doing for so many other people, but we don't take a break and pause and go, yeah, but I'm angry. Why am I angry?
Right.
I've been busy doing, but when I take a pause, I find out I'm either hurting or angry or something's going on. And you were helping to unwrap how to start to look at those things that are underneath maybe the doingness. And if you wouldn't mind just
Absolutely.
recapping some of the things that you shared in terms of how to work towards transformation. And this week, I'd love to have you share a little bit more about what are the goodies that are on the other side of working
Right.
through some of these painful things.
Right. And that's the beauty of coaching. And, there are a lot of subtle differences between therapy and coaching, and there are lots of crossovers. But I would say one of the really beautiful thing about coaching is that those goodies, I think, are more readily available and maybe more quickly than they can be in therapy. And again, not one better than the other. Therapy has a very, very important place that coaching cannot replace when it comes to mental health. So I like to emphasize that. But the goodies are that people realize that so much more is possible than they ever imagined. So, a lot of doctors, for example, will say, this is it. I invested in this, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars, and this is my lot. And I would be weak or, some sort of loser, if a failure, if I quit this. And so some of the goodies are some radical things happen, like things that I could never have predicted, where physicians, for example, decide that life is short and they're going to take 6 months off. And for some people, this is, it was unimaginable, even especially them. Some of the other goodies are even smaller than that, where they feel like they can take an afternoon off. Even coaching itself, some people carry around a coach's card for so long, thinking this is some kind of luxury, or they can't do it perfectly, so they're not going to do it. And just taking that first step to come into a coaching office
is a big deal.
And it's an incredible moment of self-care.
As you talk about all of this, I keep thinking to myself, it sounds like, how do we start to give ourselves permission? There's this, there's a
beautiful.
permission to call you. There's a permission to take the afternoon off. There's a permission to embrace 6 months of your life in a new way.
Absolutely.
And is part of that like addressing the voices in our head, or is part of that just allowing ourselves to even think that it's possible?
I think it is about addressing those voices in our head. And again, with doctors, and I would say other high achievers, the voices in the head are, don't be weak. That they somehow believe they're supposed to be superhuman. They're supposed to be able to do things that are above the human condition somehow. And
superheroes,
so, yes, it's superheroes. It really is about permission. The idea is not to rise above the human condition, but to join the human race and to recognize that your, struggles and your fatigue and your needing normal human things, it's part of being human. And
it's
that-
way okay to be human.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
a
and we
lot of
laugh,
what-
but we all know people that are. It seems like it.
Yeah.
They don't think that they have that, as you were saying, luxury.
They don't. They really, I will have people in my office say, basically something's wrong with me because I want this or because I need this. And so some of what I'm doing is normalizing their humanity and their needs that, are really fundamental human needs. And so, the goodies are really that the permission that they get to give themselves. And it doesn't happen just once. They have to continuously remind themselves that this is okay, this is normal. I have a client who talks about realizing, it's normal to have heartbreak. It's normal to have failure. It's normal. And so that's what she says to herself, just that it's normal.
And Susan,
And
it all sounds so valuable, and it reminds me of like somebody. It's as if somebody's saying, my home is not comfortable anymore, but I just can't afford to make sure the foundation is not falling apart. Like without the foundation, it's gonna fall apart eventually.
You
It
can't
is.
step around the warped. you got to deal that it's warped and not safe.
Exactly. And unfortunately, people who are trained in high resilience and trained to forego human needs like sleep and food and human touch, it takes, unfortunately, way too long to get help. So, while many doctors are talking about prevention, they themselves don't practice it, and the system itself doesn't give space for it. So for a doctor, for example, to say, I need to take care of my instrument, I am the instrument of healing, that takes such power and courage
and willingness to be vulnerable, willingness to have someone to be able to claim that I am important. That's
I am important.
Yeah, it's hard.
Yes. And so then the doing can start to happen.
Right.
But until they are able to sit with the pain, as you mentioned, they can't really move on to what is it they want to do.
Right.
A lot of people come to me saying, I want to do something different. They might even have an idea. But what ends up happening is there's a lot more being, and then the doing sort of unfolds instead of, I have to have a plan.
So, I have one last question for you, and that is, in thinking about our audience, what things would you recommend just to start with, to start looking at being and doing that may open up some acknowledgement for themselves that can allow themselves to feel more at ease in being.
Yeah. I would say, start with that normalizing hard feelings, normalizing being tired, exhausted. That's telling you something. And asking yourself, what is it telling me? I mean, the obvious is, I need to sleep. But,
there's a prescription we can all follow.
Exactly. But with burnout, it's persistent and it's not reliant on a good night's sleep.
Yeah.
So burnout is a different kind of tired.
Yeah.
And, so what's it saying to you? And really asking, what are any feeling you're having? I have a lot of people dealing with regret. What's your regret calling you to do? What's it telling you about what's really important, what really matters? So using your feelings, starting wherever you are, often it starts with physical sensations. Do you have persistent pain in your body that's not really explained? What's that saying to you? What's it calling for? So your body will scream at you if you don't listen. And so listening. Start with listening to what the signs are, what the body is saying, what your heart is saying. But it might just start with physical. A lot of muscular pain it comes with burnout. So start where you are, listen, ask yourself what it might be saying. A lot of people poo-poo journaling, but journal. And if it means just writing a list, write a list. So I think those would be my top recommendations.
Those are wonderful, Susan. I really appreciate you giving some very specific things that we can think about. When you said that, it reminded me I was on a plane one time and I mentioned to the person sitting next to me, like, yeah, I can sleep anywhere. As soon as I, put my head back, I'm asleep. And he goes, have you ever considered that you might be exhausted? It's like, yeah, I think I am. So
exactly.
You can, and even that was kind of like a nice nudge for someone else to notice for me,
Yeah. Exactly.
Well, again, thank you so much, Susan. I'm going to have you give your website to share for folks, and we'd love to have you come back sometime. We'll continue this exploration.
Love it. Thank you again for having me on.
And your website?
Wild Heart Coaching. Go ahead.
Oh, it's www.wildheart, spelled HART, coaching.com.
Thanks so much, Susan. We'll look forward to having you join us again. And you're listening to AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota on Connections Radio Show. Welcome back to Connections Radio Show, where we talk about ideas that matter. I'm Lori Fitz, your host, and Rick Bernardo is my co-host. And we've been taking an exploration of looking at being and doing. Sometimes we find ourselves doing a lot and wondering, why are we doing so much? And I feel stuck. I can't do anymore. And why is that? We've had all kinds of wonderful guests that join us. And this guest is all about unsticking things. And I look forward to having her share her ideas and what she does now. And I also want to mention that she also used to have a show here on AM 950. So we welcome back a former host of AM 950's lineup. So welcome, Susan Shahata.
Thank you, Lori.
We're glad you're here. So tell us about the work you're doing.
All right. Well, like you said, I work to help people unstick things. I help people unstick their stories by releasing the limiting beliefs that keep them stuck. So I do that through individual and corporate education, as well as I use a collection of experiential modalities to really help people unwind patterns that live in our brains and our bodies and show up as thoughts, feelings, behaviors, things of that nature.
And when you're helping them to get unstuck, I notice in some of the write-ups that you've done, some of it's tracking on trauma. Tell me about that.
Yeah, that's correct. Well, these patterns that I'm talking about that live in our brains and our bodies, they're typically connected to either adverse or traumatic past experiences that we've had, and they end up expressing themselves in all areas of our life, personal lives, professional lives, and oftentimes we're getting stuck based on one of those difficult or traumatic experiences that we had. So, for example, at some point in our life, something happened, and that experience really sets up in our brain and our body with some specific takeaways, like beliefs like I'm unsafe or people abandon me. And then those beliefs, they go on to create havoc in our lives at various levels. And that's oftentimes what's keeping us stuck.
Can you give an example of someone who, or either yourself or others that you've worked with, what trauma created the stuck and how you helped them work through getting to the place of being unstuck?
Yeah. So one of the things that's helpful to understand is when I'm talking about these bodily memories, it's that when we experience something difficult or traumatic, and I can give some examples of that as well, basically what happens is our body has an unconscious physiological response that we're usually familiar with, this idea of fight or flight, but there's actually a number of different trauma responses: fight, flight, freeze, fawn, flop. And these trauma responses, what happens is they come up in that original experience, but in the present moment, whenever a stressful situation comes up that might remind the body of that past experience, our body has that default response to one of those states, and we can get stuck there. So we often think of being stuck as being frozen, like immobile, not being able to move forward.
Like a rabbit when it's in fear, it just stops.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that would be like our freeze response. But really, we can get stuck in any of our trauma responses. We can get stuck in anger, which would be our fight response. We could get stuck in avoidance, which would be our flight response. So we can really get stuck in any of these stress or trauma responses.
I have a question that's the physical, and the body has taken in this bad experience. The body can take in a good experience as well. I bring this up only because I remember when I first started getting back into horseback riding, and I had horses when I was a kid. I would use a saddle and my leg would go in a certain way, and all of a sudden it opened up wonderful memories of riding. And I knew there was something that my body had responded to. Do you ever use, not only for the trauma, but also for some joyous opportunities, what the body can tap into?
Yeah, that's such a wonderful question, and you're really hitting it on the head with that. Our body is storing these somatic or body-based memories, and we have access to all of these really wonderful, joyful memories as well. So oftentimes in a trauma recovery process, we are helping people anchor back to some of those positive memories that you're talking about as well, and really helping people understand that what's happening in the first place is bodily memory. Because I think a lot of times when we have these stress responses, these trauma responses, because they're automatic, oftentimes, almost all the time, they're unconscious, we don't understand what's happening, and then we tell ourselves stories about it. Like, oh, I'm so lazy, or I'm so dumb, or I'm so whatever kind of negative self-talk might be happening there.
Which are really harsh shaming, that to hold on to that.
Yeah,
right? Our self-shaming, in self-talk.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so when we start to understand that these are bodily memories, I think we can give ourselves a lot more grace and start to work with them a little differently.
I love that idea of giving ourselves grace through how our body reacts, and that just opens up all sorts of possibilities, doesn't it? It allows us not to be mean to ourselves.
It really does, because I think so much of this work is about self-compassion. And ultimately, with that self-compassion, we begin to have more compassion for other people as well. Because I think a lot of times what happens is all of our personal trauma ends up collecting and becoming this very much collective trauma that we're projecting outward. So when we're doing this work for ourselves, we're really doing it to be a better member of our community as well, because it serves not only us, but it serves the collective when we do our individual work.
Do you have a sense of why it's hard for us to be compassionate to ourselves?
Oh, goodness. Well, so often these experiences were set up in a way that created a lot of shame. You already mentioned the word shame, and I think that is spot on with a lot of this. And that's because in a lot of these experiences, they were when we were quite young and feeling oftentimes quite powerless. And I think a sense of powerlessness oftentimes will leave us with feelings of shame. And then, of course, that's compounded if it happened in a situation where there was abuse or something where there was really explicit shaming or blaming that took place as part of the situation as well.
And
so a lot of times,
that gets deep-rooted.
Very deep-rooted in the body.
Interesting.
Yeah, they say that shame is something that we begin to experience even in infancy.
Wow.
So that shows you how far back this stuff can go. And it also shows you how pre-verbal some of these memories are and why it's important for us to work on a body-based or somatic level when we're trying to unstick these stories, because so many of these stories were set up in early childhood before we had verbal understanding where we could simply process it through language, before we might have even had language at all.
Susan,
Yeah.
we need to go to break, and I want to make sure that folks know how to reach you. And I want to continue our conversation in our next segment, because I have a couple more questions for you. I want to be able to explore with you. So please give us the website, your website that people can learn more about the work you do.
Yes, it's my name, SusanShahata.com, SusanShehata.
And we'll come back after a short break with commercials and learn more about how you can help unstick our stories. And thank you so much for joining us on Connections Radio Show here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. For joining us today with Connections Radio Show. We're exploring being and doing. I am your host, Lori Fitz, and Rick Bernardo is my co-host, who brought these wonderful guests together based on conversations we were having about being and doing. And you have brought some wonderful people. Thank you.
Every one of them, an angle, a window, a mirror into aspects of our being where we generally can get stuck. It's not a question of yes or no, it's just how. And that's just being human. And Susan Shahata at SusanShahata.com, S-H-E, just like she, H-A-T-A. That's how you spell her name. I know her back from being on AM 950 radio with her Raising the Consciousness program some years ago. And since then, I haven't even been able to keep total track of all the things she does to be along with people, support them in various aspects of breakthroughs and getting unstuck in different ways. Susan, what I'm interested in, we were just talking about different aspects of sort of a background narrative where we get stuck. Sometimes we don't even know it's there because it was pre-verbal for us. What kind of tools do we use to not necessarily dismantle, but even to notice those things going on with us?
Yes. So I do a number of different things that help people have a better understanding of that, whether that's the individual or corporate education I do. And I mentioned that piece because I think a big part of this is even learning about it and understanding that these things exist and that they're happening in our bodies. And then it becomes, what do we do? Like you said, it's a noticing process. So I work with people on both the cognitive or mind-based level and also the somatic or body-based level with a number of experiential modalities, as I mentioned earlier. So that includes anything from something that I call story work, where I use a specific technique to help people identify themes where they're getting stuck in their life. I do something called conscious connected breath work, which is a somatic process where people can really begin to unwind these patterns, utilizing the breath as a tool to access some of this unconscious material that gets stored in the body. And then I also do a lot of work with communication and conflict management. So I help people do relational work. And then finally, as if that wasn't enough modalities, I do work with people's physical environments, their physical spaces, which is such a wonderful tool to help us take what's happening internally, where we can't always see it, and witness it in our external space. So a number of different tools that people can use.
And I'm curious about your soul space work that you were just mentioning. Tell me more about that.
So the space work, I just include the word soul, space, story in the work that I do, because on the deepest level, what we're working at is the things that are hanging out on the deepest levels of our being, which many people identify as the soul, and the way that stuff manifests into different aspects of our life, including our physical environment. And so I work with people to help them see how they can align their space with their lives. And that might be anything from core values that they hold or needs that they have for, say, safety or connection. It might be different kinds of life goals that they're trying to achieve, from writing a book to spending more time with family or whatever it might be. And we're going to really look at how the space is a reflection of those goals, of those values, and see if we can bring them into alignment more.
Interesting. So if you are wanting to write your book, how do you create a space that makes it more conducive for you wanting to go to that space and do that writing?
Exactly. Absolutely. A lot of times what we need, and this has been scientifically researched, is these prompts in our physical environment to remind the brain, hey, remember we're going to write that book, and here is our nice little comfortable area where we're going to sit down and do that, versus a desk full of clutter that maybe doesn't feel very inspirational or inviting or creative. Unless it does. So again.
And I can relate to that. I actually started to get into beautiful pens for my to-do lists for everything. And it really it makes it more joyous for me. For a long time, it was like, oh, where's this? And you're looking for a pen or a pencil. But now I take pride in, I know I'm going to have to make some lists every day. Why not have a beautiful pen that makes me feel good about writing that to-do list?
And there's so much of a depth and breadth of various traditions, many of them Japanese and Chinese, around environment. It's just feng shui, things like that, where I've always been fascinated with how energy flows within us, but also around us. And I know Susan Shahad has been working in that field for a long time.
Susan, another thing that I find, and getting back to my horse as a memory, I know that I went to the barn a lot when I wanted to find peace, when I wanted to have a place where I didn't have the voices in my head, because I felt so connected in my barn. And I still do that today. I have a barn now with my horses. Do you help with kind of in finding your peace? What gives you joy, in addition of things that you need to do?
Exactly. Well, because the thing is that we want to have those spaces. Remember I said earlier that we have those bodily memories that we can anchor back to. Well, just like that, in our physical environments, we can create a specific space, like you're saying, where it is a space that invites us to come into it and either be or do in a certain way. So it might be something that is more active, like we mentioned, the writing of the book, but it can simply be a place where we're sipping our coffee and relaxing and looking out the window at our garden, or just doing a quiet reflection exercise, meditation exercise. And when we have a specific space that we do that, just like you're saying with your barn, the body remembers. And if we're having a stressful day at work and we go into that intentional space we've created, the body goes, oh, hey, this is the place where my breath relaxes.
It does.
And
my happy place,
exactly.
as they say.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
we can start creating, what does it mean to have a happy place for whatever our intention is?
That's a thing.
Absolutely.
Susan, your insights are wonderful and allow us to imagine possibilities for ourselves. We have about a minute and a half left. I'd love to have you give some recommendations to our audience of things that they may want to think about in being and doing.
Well, I think the biggest thing that is important is intention setting, especially since we are in a new year and it's in the collective to be thinking in terms of what do I want for myself going forward. I think it's a great time for us to even just get quiet if we have that space to do so. And this is different than goal setting because it's really more about it's more about an underlying intent, whether that's to be in a calmer state or to be in a more active state, meaning I'm going to move my body more in this new year, or I'm going to notice bodily sensations in a different way. And it's a much more fluid and forgiving thing than setting New Year's resolutions or whatnot. But I think one of the biggest things to this work of unsticking our stories really begins in the noticing process,
Right.
like we're talking about. So I would say that that's the
Thanks.
biggest thing is how do I start noticing?
Thanks so much, Susan. SusanShahada.com. That's who we've been speaking with at Connections Radio, Lori Fitz and I. Thank you so much, Susan.
Susan, we're going to invite you back, and I appreciate you letting the audience know about things to be thinking about. You're great. We'll look forward to next time.
Thank you.